Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is chapter 10, the era of good feelings. Now, the era of good feelings is a period of U.S. history in which, well, it's a little debatable if it was an era of good feelings, but we're going to see why people say that in a second, and we're going to sort of kind of in the back of our minds evaluate if it's true or not. Was this an era of increased national unity, or was this a period of increased sectionalism? The word sectionalism means political divisions based on regions, aka sections, of a country. And in this case, the three regions we're going to talk about are the North, the South, and the West. All right. Now, before I set the timer, let's look at the lesson objectives right here. So, we're going to take a look at culture. We're going to take a look at political and regional interests, and then we'll take a look at America's foreign policy in the early 1800s. All right. Setting timer on my phone for 20 minutes. Might go a little bit longer, unfortunately, but let's go ahead and get started. One, two, three, boom. All right. Now, what is the era of good feelings? Well, the era of good feelings is a name given by some historians for this period after the War of 1812. It is most closely associated with the presidency of James Monroe. James Monroe is our fifth president, kind of counting them off. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. We're on our fifth president now. Monroe was almost unanimously elected, both of his terms actually, and we kind of see that it is a period in which America is going to feel a sense of increased nationalism. And there are some examples of that, as we're going to see in just a second. It is a time of nationalism. It is a time of a distinct American culture starting to emerge. And generally, there is political unity. The War of 1812 not only produced a sense of nationalism, but it killed off the Federalist Party. For all intents and purposes, the only political party that exists in the period after the War of 1812 is the Democratic Republican Party. And that's going to be true until the election of 1824, which is considered the ending point of this era of good feelings. And yet, even before that divisive election that we will talk about later at the end of this video, we see that America is suffering some problems of sectionalism. So, if this was a sort of AP prompt, it might ask you, was this period appropriately named or not? So let's dive into it. Well, if you want to say that it was indeed a period of national unity, let's talk about some examples of that. Why do people call it an era of good feelings? Well, for one thing, probably the most obvious reason is going to be the creation of a distinct national American culture. And there's a lot of different examples of that we're going to talk about in just a second. For one thing, kind of there is this rise in thinking of how to celebrate America. 4th of July celebrations start to become a thing, for example, celebrating American independence, celebrating our national heroes like George Washington, for example. But we also see that kind of the era of good feelings is really kicked off to a really good start when Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of the American Revolution, he is going to visit from France to the United States to see what the United States is up to after 50 years of independence, more or less. And what he sees is, well, America's off to the is on the right track. Yeah, there's slavery, sure, and that's bad, but other than that, America's doing pretty good. Symbols of national unity. And kind of we see this especially, this American culture in the arts. For one thing, one of the first distinctly American novels is going to be a book called The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. And The Last of the Mohicans really represents kind of American history. It's from the French Indian War period. It represents our fascination with westward expansion. It's very much about kind of the idea of the Native Americans, their time is at the end. Now is the time of the white American man. So, Last of the Mohicans, one of kind of the earliest forms of American culture in the written form. We see that architecture as well. It does borrow heavily from European neoclassicism, but we do see the rise of what we call Federalist architecture. Federalist architecture not associated with the political party. It's associated with guys like Jefferson, actually. It's associated with guys like, oh my God, what's his name? The Washington D.C. guy. He designed Washington D.C. It's like La Infant or something, if Infant or something. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So, Federalist architecture includes things like Monticello. It includes things like the White House. It includes the ideas that are being drawn up for the national capital, for example. So, kind of the use of Roman and Greek architecture, domes, arches, all these wonderful things, columns, that's going to kind of be another symbol of Americans' pride in our democratic Republican nature, and small d on both of those. But we also see kind of in the visual arts, America is kind of inspired by European Romanticism. And we see that in a lot of different ways. We see that in sort of nationalist paintings from the American Revolution, but we also see that in things like the Hudson River School. Now, the Hudson River School was kind of not a literal school, but it was a group of artists who are going to especially focus on the beauty of God's country, aka nature. An example of that right here is the Oxbow by our good friend Thomas Cole. It really represents this idea of westward expansion, this idea of celebrating what makes America so unique from the rest of the world, and it's our natural geography, it's our natural environment. So, Hudson River School, this is kind of an example of a distinct American style of art emerging. But politically, kind of, there are some things you could say that are examples of political unity. For one thing, as I mentioned earlier, James Monroe's election was almost uncontested. We see that he wins virtually all of the Electoral College vote. And the reason why is the Democratic Republicans are really the only party that exists. The Federalists do run some candidates, but honestly, they're not going to have that big of an impact. They are a mostly irrelevant party in this era of national unity. However, Monroe is assisting with kind of this ease away from having the Federalist Party with his cabinet, actually. James Monroe is going to appoint a kind of intergenerational, interregional, not international, that's a little too far, national cabinet that represents the North, the South, and the West. For example, he chooses his Secretary of State to be John Quincy Adams, who was a former Federalist. He chooses Calhoun to operate as the Secretary of War. He chooses all of these individuals who are from the North, the South, and the West, kind of as a symbol of national unity. But after his election, he also visits virtually all of the states that exist in his presidency. We're going to see his goodwill tour after his first election, in which he visits a lot of Federalist strongholds in the New England parts of the United States. Kind of this is a symbol of national unity. But another symbol of national unity is actually going to be the desire from some nationalists, namely Henry Clay, to push for the American system. Now, the American system is a political program designed to create a national economy, one in which the South provides cotton to the North, the North produces textiles and other manufactured products. Now, how do we build this national economy? We are going to have a government that is going to be interested in the following programs. And you need to memorize these three parts of the American system. The first part is reintroducing the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States expired in 1812, actually, just before the War of 1812. And we see that kind of, or 1810 rather, and that is kind of during James Madison's presidency. But after the War of 1812, to sort of repay the losses from that war, we kind of see a push for the Bank of the United States. And this bank is not only designed to increase national federal power, it's also designed to increase kind of the financial stability and centralization of the United States economy by having one big mama bank being in charge of our currency system. So, bank, but it also includes tariffs. Tariffs, generally favored by the North, they are going to be things that make foreign goods more expensive. Why is that important? Because it makes Americans want to have to buy American. American products are more expensive compared to British products, but in order to encourage American consumers to purchase American, that's why these industrialists and manufacturers, they're going to push for a high protective tariff. And in the early part of James Monroe's presidency, we do have a high protective tariff. But we also see our final thing is internal improvements. We want to unify the country in terms of transportation by building a federal infrastructure project, the Old National Road. More on that in a second. But in terms of kind of foreign policy, we see that Americans are going to be rather aggressive towards European influence that remains in North and South America. And an example of that kind of is the idea of the Monroe Doctrine. I guess I can summarize the Monroe Doctrine by saying this phrase right here. It believes in the idea of the Americas for the Americans. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in the early 1800s, in the 1810s and 1820s, various Spanish colonies were gaining their independence. And what were they becoming? They were becoming republics just like us, just like their big sister, the United States. However, there was a legitimate fear by both the Latin Americans, but also the United States, that the former colonial master of Spain could recolonize the Latin America. So, kind of in response to that fear, the United States' federal government under James Monroe, but written by John Quincy Adams, is going to draft the Monroe Doctrine. What the Monroe Doctrine says is basically this: Spain, France, Portugal, if you guys try to recolonize North America, we'll fight you. It is their right to use a later term in this class, self-determination. America for the Americans. So, kind of all peoples of the Americas, they deserve to have their own republican forms of government free from colonial intervention. If they don't want to be colonies anymore, Spain's got to respect that. Now, the ironic thing about this Monroe Doctrine is two things. For one thing, it is actually an example of isolationism, you could argue. Because what Americans are basically saying is, Europe, stick to Europe, we'll stick to our own thing over here. And that's kind of a callback to George Washington in a way. No foreign entanglements. But it also represents actually a very ironic thing about it is that actually the group that's going to really enforce the Monroe Doctrine is the British Empire. The United States' military is pretty weak in the early 1800s. We don't have the capability to fight off even a weakened colonial power like Spain. So what we do is we ally with the British on this. And the reason why is that the British, they want to do business with these newly independent countries in Latin America. They see them as untapped markets for British manufactured goods, but also to buy cheap raw materials. So these are all symbols of national unity that generally bring the country together. And yet, there are symptoms of sectionalism in the early 1800s. For one thing, the American system, despite wanting to bring the country together, ultimately has the effect of tearing the country apart on some level. For one thing, the two most controversial parts of the American system is the bank and the tariff, actually. Now, the Bank of the United States, it was rechartered in 1816, but it is going to be severely controversial. It's run by a lot of nitwits. It's not very properly managed. And we do see that it is accused of causing various financial depressions in the early 1800s. For one thing, in the Panic of 1819, the bank was blamed for having a lax policy of lending a lot of money to smaller private banks. These smaller private banks decided to lend that money to average citizens. And they were over lending to average citizens. Average citizens, namely land speculators, were buying cheap land and then flipping it at a profit. But when the price of land suddenly goes down, the speculators don't have the money to pay back the loans. The banks need to foreclose on a lot of loans that they gave out to other businesses. It causes an economic depression. And unfortunately for the bank, I guess, the bank is blamed for causing this. And the group most impacted by this panic were people who lived out west, were people who wanted to make their money selling Western land, namely Western farmers. But also, Southerners blamed the Bank of the United States, or thought of the Bank of the United States, as only really benefiting one part of the country, the North. Northerners and Northern businesses liked the bank because of the stability it provided, because of the loans that it gave out to Northern banks, which then in turn gave out loans to Northern businesses, Northern factories. So these parts of the country, the South and the West, they despise the Bank of the United States. They blame it for causing depressions. They blame it for favoring one region over the others. There's also the tariff debate as well. The West doesn't really care all that much about tariffs, but the South especially does. The South has no manufacturing whatsoever, and they don't really want to have to buy American. They want to get their stuff on the cheap from the British, for example. So the South really hates the tariff, especially one of the highest tariffs in American history called the Tariff of 1828, also sometimes called the Tariff of Abominations. Now, this tariff, the story you don't need to really know about its kind of passage, but the tariff is really high. And kind of in protest of this really high tariff, we see a lot of Southern opposition, especially represented in the form of John C. Calhoun. Calhoun is going to write something called Exposition and Protest in reaction to the Tariff of 1828. And what he says in Exposition and Protest is this: if a state finds a federal law unconstitutional, that state should have the right to nullify, aka not enforce, that federal law. And if the federal government tries to make that state follow that law, the state has the right to secede from the Union. This is going to become a much bigger deal in our last chapter of Unit 3, but it's a symbol of Southern opposition to this thing that mostly Northerners favor. And in terms of internal improvements, generally everybody likes them, especially the West, but there are debates about the cost of these internal improvements. And really, the only thing that's built using federal funding in the early 1800s is the Old National Road. That is one of your terms. It's eventually opened and expanded in the 1820s, 1810s. However, another symbol of increasing sectionalism, at least according to some historians, is the Missouri Compromise. You see, Missouri, which was a state that was formed out of Louisiana Purchase, they wanted to join the Union as a slave state. However, before Missouri, there kind of was a balance in the United States Senate. However, adding Missouri would upset that balance. So, in response, there is a lot of Northern opposition to adding Missouri as a slave state. However, to smooth things over, there is the Missouri Compromise. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, he's going to draft it. And what he says in this compromise is this: Missouri gets to be a slave state, but Maine in the North is added as a free state. So, in that sense, it kind of sets up a tradition of balance of power between slave and free states. However, it is going to be controversial because it does set a line across the Louisiana Purchase, the 3630 parallel. What this 3630 parallel does is that it basically says everything above this line, except Missouri, is a free state. Everything below this line is a slave state. Now, in the short term, it is a good compromise, but you could argue it does symbolize growing fears about slavery among the North against the South. But finally, kind of what ends this era of good feelings? It's divisions, it's unity, whatever you want to call this period. Well, the election that ends it is the election of 1824. In 1824, James Monroe decides to step down from the White House. And now we've got to have an election. But in 1824, the Federalist Party is not even going to pretend to run a candidate. They've been running kind of opposition figures before this election, but 1824, they just cease operations altogether. And we're going to see that now the United States has to choose a president, but there's only one political party. So initially, to determine who's going to be the next president, well, we have to talk about something called the caucus system. Now, during this period, when America only really had one party, members of the Democratic Republican Party, they would form what was called a caucus. Basically, this was a meeting that they would have outside of Congress, and at this caucus, all of the party elites, they would take a vote and they would say, okay, we want this guy to be our candidate. And this King Caucus, as it was called, they initially choose a guy named William Crawford. However, not a lot of people actually attended this caucus. It was viewed as something that was super elitist, and it didn't account for the will of the common person. You see, 1824 is one of the first presidential elections where the common, ordinary person could actually vote. Most states in the Union had gotten rid of propertyship qualifications to vote. However, because of this perception that the vote wasn't very democratic, other people start saying, well, I should be president. There's a guy named Andrew Jackson, there's Henry Clay, and there's John Quincy Adams. All three of these guys also throw their hat into the ring. However, eventually we are going to see that the election is voted on, and there's going to be in the Electoral College, no one gets the necessary majority. Andrew Jackson gets a plurality, and he gets a majority of the popular vote, but the popular vote doesn't matter. We see the Electoral College is what matters, and not all of the Electoral College voted for Andrew Jackson. He didn't get a majority. So it then is going to be decided by the House of Representatives, but it's in the House of Representatives where things get a little dicey and shaky. You see, Henry Clay came in fourth place, but he was the Speaker of the House. And as the leader of the House of Representatives, he's going to use his political machinations to convince representatives to vote not for Andrew Jackson, who got the majority again in the popular vote and a plurality in the Electoral College, but convince the House of Representatives to vote for John Quincy Adams. Quincy Adams is going to become president. However, in exchange, at least allegedly, Quincy Adams is going to give Henry Clay the Secretary of State position. Now, this seems like a minor detail, but it's actually kind of important because the Secretary of State was seen as a stepping stone to the presidency. So essentially, what Quincy Adams was kind of saying to the American public was, I want this guy to be president next. Now, Andrew Jackson is mad at the election results in 1824. He accuses Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams of conducting a corrupt bargain. And really, this is going to divide the country between supporters of Andrew Jackson, those who agree that he was indeed cheated of this election, and those who say, no, it was fair and square. And that's really going to lead us to the next period of American history. The John Quincy Adams presidency doesn't matter all that much. That's when the Tariff of 1828 was passed, and it makes him super unpopular. Now, that's actually it for this era of good feelings. Whether or not it was an era of good feelings is up to you. Was there more sectionalism? Was there more nationalism? It's up to your interpretation. All right, I'm over my time, but I'm going to stop right there. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful, blessed day, and